can hear me or not.
Hello, Harry.
Hi, Veronica. How are you?
Fine. I speak a little English. Luimar, hello.
Hello,
Hi.
Harry.
Welcome, Harry.
Can you hear you? Is
Yeah,
everything
it's good to
okay?
see you both.
In a few minutes, we can start. Okay.
Sure.
El lema de esta semana es Ingeniería del Desarrollo para una Argentina competitiva. Lo vamos a estructurar en 4 módulos. El módulo de energía, liderado por Ricardo Marcus, CEO de Tecpetrol. El módulo del agro, liderado por Pablo Noceda, que es el CEO de Molinos Agro. El módulo de minería, liderado por Alfredo Vitaller, que es el gerente general del proyecto José María. El módulo de industria, liderado por el ingeniero Martín Berardi, que es el CEO de Ternium Argentina. Creo que es una excelente oportunidad, no solo por poder participar de forma virtual, sino por lo interesante de los temas en un contexto del mundo, de la región y del país, que va a permitir y nos va a guiar en lo que va a ser una agenda de trabajo de aquí para adelante. Así que muchas gracias.
a empezar, bajamos el volumen. Bueno, muy buenos días a todos. Buen día, Harry, nuevamente. Hoy es un día que vamos a compartir una nueva CAI Talk. La CAI Talk de hoy se llama Cómo planificar ciudades inteligentes para la sociedad de la innovación, y van a conversar en esta oportunidad el doctor Harry Bradbury, Presidente Ejecutivo de Imaginatives Group, y el Presidente del Centro Argentino de Ingenieros, Pablo Bereciartúa. Pero no solo va a ser una conversación como las que venimos sosteniendo, sino que en este evento vamos a comunicar que al señor Harry Bradbury se lo ha nombrado socio honorario por el Comité Directivo del CAI. Ahora Pablo Bereciartúa va a decir unas palabras de esto. Yo voy a leer una breve reseña de Harry. Toda la bio un poco más completa la pueden encontrar en la web del CAI. Yo lo que voy a decir es que Harry cuenta con 45 años de carrera liderando el trabajo en todas las categorías de lo que hoy se denominan Objetivos de Sostenibilidad de las Naciones Unidas, ODS. Tiene una carrera académica de una década en el Reino Unido, Cambridge y Londres, y como profesor de Ciencias Planetarias y Terrestres de la Universidad de Yale en Estados Unidos. Licenciado en Biociencias y Geociencias y doctor en Geociencias por la Universidad de Liverpool, nacido en Yorkshire, casado y con 6 hijos, ha vivido en Northumberland, Reino Unido, durante más de una década. Fue fundador y CEO de 2 startups puras, las cuales fueron exitosas en grupos de empresas angloamericanas, Bolsa de Londres, en medio ambiente y tecnología limpia. Con esta breve bio, introduzco a Pablo Bereciartúa para que ya comience la CAI Talk de hoy. Solo digo que los invitamos a participar de esta conversación dejando en el chat por escrito preguntas que luego Pablo compartirá con Harry. Harry, bienvenido, muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos.
Muchas gracias, Verónica, y muy buenos días a todos. Es para mí un gran gusto mantener esta CAI Talk que vamos a comenzar ahora con el doctor Harry Bradbury. Como sabemos, de aquí en más lo vamos a hacer en inglés, así que voy a pasar a ese idioma. So, good morning, everybody. It is for me a real pleasure to do the opening and to start this event with our guest, Dr. Harry Bradbury. It is a real honor for me to be holding this activity at the Argentinian Engineering Center. And to begin with our event, I would like to say, hello, Harry, how are you doing and where are you now?
Well, it's kind of you to ask, Pablo, and it's my distinct pleasure to see you and to meet all of your various colleagues. In terms of where I am, I'm actually in the frozen north of England, quite close to the Scottish border, probably about 2 miles from the what's called Hadrian's Wall, which was built a few thousand years ago by a Roman emperor, trying to keep the Scottish from coming to England. But being half Scottish, I'm perfectly happy to be here on either side of the border. So that's physically where I am at the moment.
That is very interesting because that is still a conversation that is going on. What should be the relationship between the Scottish and England? But we will may get into that later. But let me go on with our event now. And at this point, what I'd like to do is I would like to do a public announcement that our institution, a 125-year-old institution, which is the Argentinian Engineering Center, it is the main institution around engineering in the country. And it has a very high degree that from time to time it is awarded to some people. According to our law, that degree, which is honorary fellow of our institution, it is conferred to men or women in science, engineering, or any other significant field who have been distinguished by their contribution to the world, the humanity, their country, or the profession, and in issues and topics that are highly positive for the development of their societies. This is a designation, a degree, that is a lifelong degree without any charge, and it is conferred without any presentation by the people that is awarded this degree. So it is our highest government board that in unanimity decides who is in a condition to be awarded this degree. So for us, Harry, it is a real honor to do this public announcement that our institution, the Argentinian Engineering Center, is willing to distinguish you with the degree of honorary fellow.
Well, I'm immensely flattered and honored by your announcement, Pablo, and I'm extremely grateful to you and your board for viewing me in this sort of a way. I don't feel as though I could merit this, but I'm very happy to step up to the challenge of trying to prove myself worthy of the accolade. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And typically what we do is we will be holding this conversation, which is basically an opportunity to open to your ideas and how you see things, and what is your experience, but also how do you project into the future your mind and your ideas regarding some big issues have to do with your own experience. So let me begin with that by asking you, what is innovation for you?
Yes, that's probably the biggest question you could ask right at the very beginning of our conversation. I mean, for me, innovation has always been creativity that makes some long-lasting difference. I think it can come in many forms, and of course, over centuries, we've had many innovators. I think the tendency is to focus on the modern generation of innovators, perhaps not surprisingly. I mean, we think of Apple and Amazon and Alphabet and Microsoft and the sort of high-tech companies as all very innovative, which of course they are. Of course, it's well worth remembering that most of the actual innovators within those organizations started out in garages or university dormitories. They didn't start out with anything other than a main idea. And it's taken an awful lot of work for each of them to reach the sort of pinnacle of the heights that they reached. We did a quick analysis a few years ago, trying to, because we were working quite a lot in Africa, for example, and we figured out that if you took a sort of collective of those sorts of companies, Amazon, Apple, Hewlett-Packard, Harley-Davidson, some of the household names, it's remarkable that in about 13 companies created by only 22 people, they've created value which is greater than the GDP of the whole of Africa, about $4 trillion. Now, you could say that, well, innovation, is somewhat off-putting because trying to reach that sort of pinnacle is obviously a great challenge. What I would say is that, for Latin America generally, for Africa, as we've said to them, we have to be able to find 22 people throughout Latin America who are equally capable, who, given the opportunity, can actually rise to the same sort of heights. And that, I think, is one of the challenges of innovation generally. We tend to think of it as people who are on their own and they have a moment of genius and then something comes of it. It's never been like that. Of course, there are moments of genius, but if you take any of the people that I've talked about, I mean, normally they're in either ones or handfuls of people. What seems to be typical is that, people don't do things by committee. It's a relatively small team that achieves something. So if you took, the two Steves, Jobs and Wozniak, or you took, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, these kind of combinations are the norm for those that are capable of actually doing this. But I think, rather than just focusing on the modern era, I think we have to go way back into history, and we can find, of course, genius everywhere, in every continent, in every walk of life. But it still doesn't come immediately to people or instinctively. You take Charles Darwin, for example. I mean, he of course was a contemporary of Alfred Russel Wallace, and the two of them, worked in collaboration and sometimes competition to actually get to where they were. But I find it remarkable that for Darwin, for example, there was someone called Al-Jahiz who was in Baghdad 1,000 years before Darwin, who wrote something called the Book of Animals, which essentially is the same script as Darwin's evolutionary theory. So sometimes it takes quite a while for people to latch on to an idea and to do something with it. So I think that for me, it got to have some element of creativity associated with it. It's got to have some lasting value to it as well, but it's also got to have an awful lot of workup. It's got to have a period of time. It's got to have a lot of activities. If you took Beethoven, for example, clearly a genius, but the records show now that for his Fifth Symphony, for example, you know, da 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 da. I mean, I would play it for you, but you'd be relieved to know the piano is in a different room. What he actually worked that up about 14 times after the first bars that he put together. He had 14 attempts at what came after that. So I think that's a good example of, you know, the fact that there is perhaps a moment of genius, a spark that people have, but they still have to be completely dedicated to what they're doing. They're often, of course, motivated. They're not in any way motivated, or usually not motivated by money or indeed by fame, but they are driven people. They have to just keep going and do what they think is important. So, I mean, for me, what it's about is creativity that has some lasting value and obviously makes some difference to society.
That's very interesting. And let me save that, because later on we will get into how maybe we can use our learning experience, so to say, so that we think how to change institutions, or maybe the way to plan according to maximize the capacity of innovation in cities, in countries. But before moving into that, I'd like to go to some of your experiences, and let me ask you regarding one of the companies that you've been involved with, which is about hydrogen. So hydrogen is now a very hot and big topic in energy transition, and some people believe that it is one of the main vectors ahead for the way economies are going to be changing, and mainly transportation and in general energy will move forward. So can you tell us what you have done with hydrogen and how you see hydrogen as an opportunity in the near term?
Yes, well, the starting point for this for me was that I'd done a lot of advisory work in energy in times past, and I'd been involved with the board of directors of various global energy companies in oil and gas, in power, and so on. They seem to me to be lacking some sort of strategy for transforming what the energy mix is going to be. This was back in the late 90s. And it was perfectly clear that we needed to move away from fossil fuels in the fullness of time. We needed to move to what nowadays are called renewables. I still think that we have a bit of a myopic view as to what renewables really means. Most people mean putting a solar panel on your roof and having a wind farm attached to you somehow. It can mean an awful lot more than that. And hydrogen is a case in point. So back in the late 90s, coming into 2000, I created a company, and historically it might be just entertaining at least to let you know how this came about, because we discovered a couple of people in the basement of a British university who had spent by then 15 years with a single piece of metal, claiming that they could convert hydrogen into electricity. And when I came along, it was quite clear that the piece of metal didn't work. And in fact, it took quite some time for it to actually work. But I could see that, were you able to do that? Were you able to convert hydrogen in a solid state device to electricity? Then there had to be a significant future for that. So that's where it started from. Where it ended up was a $1 billion company at IPO, and it's still moving forward today, now in the private sector. But when we were first looking at this, of course, and this is perhaps a case in point for innovators, you either go entirely unnoticed, or at the time you're trying to innovate, there's no commercial application for it, or you can't find the right application partner, or maybe the innovators don't actually know how to raise the funding or get the support infrastructure for it, or as in this case, it's perceived as a threat. Now, in the early stages of developing what became known as hydrogen fuel cells, we certainly faced a lot of opposition. We faced opposition from the power companies that didn't want to transform, from the car companies that didn't want to transform, and from the oil and gas companies that didn't want to transform away from hydrocarbons. So those are three of the world's biggest gorillas to go up against. And it's a very difficult job, I can tell you, to seek to persuade them that there is some merit in looking at a hydrogen future. And so in that case, it's taken actually 20 years for us to now get to where we are. And even so, we have people like Elon Musk, even though he's done spectacularly well in all sorts of other ways, he still doesn't believe that there is a future for hydrogen. He believes that everything can be done by batteries. His difficulty, of course, is that batteries have got their own issues around sourcing lithium or manganese or cobalt. There are lots of things that batteries can't do in larger vehicles, for example, that hydrogen can. So what we did was to seek to demonstrate this, and perhaps as an anecdote, we went to the UK government, and without wishing to be disrespectful to the UK government, we asked them to give us some support to market what we were designing at that time, and that was a hydrogen motorbike. The reason we were designing a motorbike was, as you can tell by looking at me, I'm obviously a big biker. Obviously, I'm not. But we decided that whilst all the car companies were at that stage talking about electric vehicles, they were really electric vehicles for you and me. They were for middle-class people. And they were four wheels, obviously as cars. Whereas at that stage, 70% of the market, say in Asia Pacific, were two-wheel vehicles. And most people couldn't afford to have an electric vehicle, and that remains the case today. So we designed, we engineered, we then built and subsequently marketed a hydrogen motorbike, which received a lot of accolades, including comment from none other than Steve Jobs, who called it a cool bike, which coming from Steve Jobs was certainly accolade enough for us. But when we asked the British government for £50,000 to market this, they said no, putting it politely. And then it took them 10 years to come back to us to ask if they could please have this motorbike in the Science Museum in London to demonstrate British innovation. So that's a sort of thumbnail sketch of what an innovator's life is about. You start out with a cute idea, a set of strategies. You try to figure out how you're going to raise money, how you're going to do that in parallel with what you're developing. You seek to persuade people it's something you should be doing or they should be doing. And you find an awful lot of obstruction in the process. But I'm delighted to say that after all of that, even though I'm not involved in that particular business anymore, it's heartening to know that 20 years later, the world is suddenly realizing that I'd like to say we were right in the first place.
That's very interesting. And what do you, your idea regarding this experience is that we are going to be moving into a faster pace for this kind of endeavors. So to say, if you wanted to do the same thing starting now, your feeling is that the conditions have changed and it will take less than 20 years or not?
Well, I think the difficulty is that we've, over this last 20 years in particular, we've rather regimented what the process ought to be for young innovators. We no longer have significant enough investment coming from private sector players. We have nowadays what are called angel investors. And from my experience, there aren't many angels in that community. We have venture capital groups, which are extremely professional. And the best of them, the likes of Kleiner Perkins or Draper Fisher Jervitz and those kind of players, are immensely smart people. But in some ways, they become a victim of their own success. Because of that success, their bandwidth to take on young upstart companies is limited. And therefore, everyone is waiting to see a company or an idea or a group of people at some state of maturity that they can benefit from them much sooner than they would ordinarily expect to do. And I think one of the difficulties now is that for anyone who's literally got a raw idea, is that there are very few channels that you can go to in order to raise sufficient capital to be able to do it. And of course, there is never enough capital to do it entirely. But to do it, you've really got to go through the systematics of venture capital kind of program, because it's almost more difficult if you haven't gone through that to persuade people later on, if you're thinking about an IPO or doing some M&A work and so on, that you are legitimate. If you've tried to do it entirely on your own, there is some suspicion that it hasn't been scrutinized sufficiently. So for anything that is entirely novel, very creative, but isn't known by anybody else, the natural tendency is to say, well, we'll come and see you later when someone else has seen you. Someone else has kicked the wheels on your vehicle, and there is nothing wrong with that in terms of the systematics of it and the care with which you have to proceed with new innovation. But it is an irony that although that is more the norm nowadays, the time frame subsequently within which people expect to get a return on their investment in you, either of time or capital, is itself foreshortened. So you have to go through a regimented process to get differing increments of support, whether it's capital or general support. And you have to do everything in much shorter timeframes than, in some cases, might be realistic. I mean, it took us about 5 years to get to where we got to with a motorbike and an airplane with Boeing and so on. There are just some things that take that length of time. So if you come across people who've got an investment appetite and want a return within 2 years, which is more the case for at least the junior levels of the venture capital world, not the senior players who understand these things, but the junior players, then I think you've got potentially some incompatibility.
Yeah, and given those conditions, which is so to say the realistic time that it takes to go from a good idea to something that is profitable and that is realistic in order to be deployed at a larger scale and to make a difference in the economy, in the life of people. So let's move into more of the core of our conversation now. How do you use that reality, so to say, in the new economy to start to think on what cities or even countries may be doing different now if they want to become a larger player, a bigger player in the new economy? So what do you think about that? How a city or even a country has to react or change to the new conditions in order to become a player in the innovation economy?
Yes, it's a very good question. I mean, I think from our experience, going back 3 decades now, the answer to that would probably be different depending on when you're actually seeking to do it. So, for example, when we first did work in Central and Eastern Europe, most of those countries were still in Soviet hands. They were looking to eventually join the EU, but they were left with the sort of architecture of that former economic system. So many of the actual enterprises were state-owned enterprises with relatively low capital, with very good skills, but very little externality. So they were very insular within their own countries. And in that particular case, we had to use a series of different mechanisms to allow them to evolve, including privatization, mergers and acquisitions, and inward investments, and so on, because they were starved of capital. They were starved of partnerships. They hadn't known enough about the benchmarks in the rest of the world, what represented the state of the art, how they could achieve it, what kind of new products or services they'd need to evolve, and so on. So there's quite a fast track in the early 90s, I would say, of needing to do it that way. Now, obviously, I'm delighted that countries like Poland, where we worked extensively, and some of the others around Estonia, Lithuania, and Czech Republic, they eventually emerged, but it did take a few years, obviously, for some parallel track between the evolution of the industry and the evolution of the economic system within which they operated. Whereas when we did work a little later in the Middle East Gulf, they, of course, had a different set of issues. They had significant wealth coming from oil and gas, but they had oil and gas, and they recognized, carefully enough, that there would be a time when they had to imagine themselves without oil and gas. So diversification of their economies, depended upon overall how they identified what to do next. Now, there are some parts of it that were already in place. We worked extensively in Bahrain, for example, which was and remains one of the centerpieces of financial services and the banking community. So there were certain nuclei that you could grow out of and embellish. But when we did that work, the crucial part of it was that we had to, from scratch, identify what might represent a new generation of Middle East economies. What would you actually choose to do if you actually had that choice? Now, obviously, there were certain sectors that would have been ridiculous to include. For example, you wouldn't expect them to have a forestry industry because they have no forests, to put it simple. But there are plenty of others that they could have selected. And the danger, I think, is that if you're in that sort of selection mode for what next, I think the onus is on you first to concentrate on the growth sectors. Now, obviously, as we are today, moved on again now in the 2020s, there are certain sectors that you would regard as important, and there are other sectors that you regard as perhaps less important looking forward. So as we are in the UK, for instance, we've got rid of our coal industry, we've got rid of our shipbuilding, our such large parts of our chemical sector, and so on. Now, there have always been arguments about whether that was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. But there are certainly clear trends that suggest that certain industries are yesterday's industries and others are tomorrow's industries. So if you're going to make a choice, quite understandably now, looking at knowledge economy, digital economies, green tech, future food, space, biotech, analytics, big data, cyber securities, these are all up and coming sectors to look at. But I think one of the difficulties, in trying to be innovative at an economy level is that there is the danger of bringing in advisors that say, these are the things that you could look at, but no one actually makes any selection. So what we did in the Middle East was to emphasize that if coupled with this, you really want to come out of this process by raising foreign direct investment, then obviously you have to have something that's sufficiently detailed and sufficiently attractive for foreign direct investors. I mean, putting it simply, there is no point saying we're bright, sunny people in a bright, sunny place, and we'll be very friendly to you if you came here, and we'll give you a free trade zone, and we'll all the soft incentives that you might expect, simply because that's what everyone offers. And it's a very competitive world out there when you're trying to attract investment. So what we emphasized was the need to get right down into the details of the specific businesses in the specific sectors that you want to create, and then to actually create them. So what we did in Bahrain, for example, was work our way down from the sort of macrocosm of every industry that existed through to the industries that we thought would be most tractable. We looked at the skill sets, the educational levels, the participants in it, the supply chains, the logistics of doing it all, and so on and so forth. But even after that, we then mapped against it what are the real growth sectors, and what are the real growth companies? And therefore, if you were to be involved in, say, next generation pharmaceuticals, who would you expect to team with? Who would you expect to be an investor in what you're doing? So in other words, you had to create the investable business plans ultimately, because that really is the only output from any work of that sort that's meaningful. Because you've got to have an executable plan. There isn't, of course, you've got to have a vision and a strategy, but if you don't have an executable plan, you're still left in the air and not being able to deliver anything.
Let me pick from there and ask you how I fully agree with you, and this is I think it's a very systemic view. So you need to think on where you want to be in the next few years, or even more than that, and also what are the differences that you are able to build or put together, and then to somehow with that information to develop a proposal, and that proposal should be interesting for people even very so to say far away from where you are, so that they will be getting you into the picture, and you will be an opportunity for them, so to say. So let's have that frame to think about Argentina. So, and maybe if you want, I know that you have experience in many other places, one of them is Africa, and that you have been working in a new city in Africa by the name of African Arc. And I don't know whether that may or not be a comparison for thinking about Argentina, but I'd like to bring you to this part of the world, and Argentina in particular. I know you've been here in Buenos Aires before. So how do you see Argentina? How is Argentina facing or could be facing this opportunity of rethinking itself?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it would be presumptuous of me to seek to give guidance to your national government, whether it's the current government or any future government. So I wouldn't wish to be so presumptuous. But all I can do is to provide, a few observations, if you will, about, and I may be wrong, but the observations I would give you are, I suppose, as follows. I mean, I think I would have a more optimistic view of Argentina than Argentina believes for itself. Because we do see, I mean, from the outside, it appears, at least to me, I can't speak for anyone else, but it appears to me as though there is insufficient confidence to solve the actual problems that currently exist. And I may have the statistics wrong, but if it's broadly correct that you've got a $45 billion debt, you've got $2.5 billion that's due to credited nations soon, you've got inflation above 50%, you've got GDP declining from 650 to 450 billion. And probably worse than all of that, you've got 57% of children up to 14 years in poverty. And in urban poverty, because of the pandemic, you're now at about 42%. And that affects 12 million people. I mean, those are the sort of broad statistics. And that's without quoting the sad losses in COVID. The question is, well, can you even discuss what the future is going to be? And can you be bold enough to try to plan for it? But you've mentioned cities. And yes, we do have a serious interest in what we call sustainable cities. I mean, the group that we have called Imaginatives is very much dedicated to not only looking at those sorts of big new pictures, but actually then embracing as part of it all of the novelties, all of the innovations. To be honest, in some ways, it's a lot easier for us to embrace, 3D printing of houses or next generation electric vehicles or future transport systems or a number of other areas in use of new materials as part and parcel of a development of the sort you mentioned in Africa, which I'll come to in a moment. But I think it's probably worth just stepping back a bit and saying that, as things stand today, I mean, Argentina means Buenos Aires in terms of, where the population is. It's not entirely true, of course, and forgive me for if you're not actually in Buenos Aires, I don't mean to be disrespectful. It's simply that that's where most of the people are. It is, of course, one of the great global megacities now. As you know, most of them are above 10 million in population. Some are above 20, at least 12 of them are. Perhaps the alarming thing is that, cities of that sort, it's almost a runaway effect that they have. Once you've reached megacity status, you continue to grow and you radiate outwards. And the difficulty is that, since Buenos Aires started in, say, 1580, that radiation has just continued. And it will continue, and you'll continue to have migration, which is true of all megacities, from the rural communities to the cities for various reasons, partly because that's where the electricity is, usually, and that's where the jobs are, therefore. And certainly in the knowledge and digital economies, that's going to be the heartland of the dynamism, as people might see it. But running counter to that right now, of course, is that people are starting to question whether or not city living is really the right thing for them. So trying to imagine what a future living system might look like that's good for you and your families doesn't necessarily lead you to the conclusion that you should be in a city at all. So we shouldn't necessarily restrict, the conversation to cities. Towns are equally important, villages are equally important, rural communities are equally important. But, as you look around the world and you see what's happening in China, for example, which is obviously building a number of megacities, the difficulty there is that with an aging population and with migration to the major urban centers, depletion of the rural communities, eventually you end up with all the young people coming towards the city, all the older people living outside the city. And for things like agriculture and food production and so on, which you have to do obviously in a rural context, usually, that creates all manner of logistics issues, financing issues. I think we pay far too little attention as to how to finance the rural community and far too much attention to the urban environments, because that's where all the voters are, frankly. But the danger is that if you now go to the next level, the predictions for 2100 onwards is that cities like Lagos are going to reach nearly 90 million people. Kinshasa the same, Dar es Salaam, Bombay, Delhi. Well, we've seen what's happened in Delhi of late, sadly. And it was never fit for purpose in terms of its electricity, in terms of its water supply, its sanitation, its education. There are so many difficulties around the dominancy of half the world's population now living in urban environments. And perhaps the pandemic, therefore, is saying to people that we should readjust the way we think about these things. It's certainly happening in countries like Italy, for example, where many of the young populations that have gone to Rome or Florence and so on are now going back to the more ancient villages because they can, because the internet is there. A different style of working is possible for them, whereas previously it wasn't. So as we sort of evolve into the next generation growth industries, it's entirely possible, therefore, that we rebalance the urban environment and rethink it. But as I think about it in terms of Argentina, and again, I may be wrong, but it looks to me to be an imbalanced economy as things stand. Roughly speaking, 22% is industry, 78% is service sector. Now, 78% service sector is good if you've got global players and an outreach and an international view of things. So if you're in fintech or know-how or advisory services, and you can do it on a global basis, that's fine. But service sector, very crudely, of course, if you're internalized and you're thinking only about your own country or your own region, means talking to each other, putting it very simply. And that obviously won't raise sufficient revenues to be able to cope with what it is needs to happen in terms of at least the debt repatriation process. There will no doubt be some debt forgiveness process along the way, but it won't be absolute, and it will come with strings attached to it. So solving that debt crisis in the fullness of time is something that I think all governments, it behoves them to actually do it. I think this is where I think cities can come in. If I can be bold enough to suggest, a model that might, it seems to me, be worth considering. Given that you've got that balance of economy, the old adage that you should grow out of a crisis is still true. And many governments, of course, use infrastructure as a way to increase employment, accelerate the economy. But normally it expresses itself in terms of building roads or building bridges, which as engineers we love to do, of course. But there is the option of building new cities. So if I look at Buenos Aires, there are many aspects of the city where you've had progressive infill of the city. It doesn't have much green space. It's crowded. It has difficulties in transportation issues, and it's expanding outwards. The difficulty with all cities like that is that you end up with a core city, which is where most of the more valuable properties are. You end up with a peri-urban ring around it, where the least valuable properties are. And in fact, you end up with a lot of slum areas. Wherever you leave a patch of ground, you end up with slum areas. And that makes it even more difficult for the city to evolve, because you end up with difficulties with expansion of the city. And so what normally happens is that you get a leapfrogging of the people who are in the core of the city to the outskirts. So they're outside the city, where you probably are in the Delta, for example. And over time, the city fragments because it reduces the value of the properties in the core. You still end up with a peri-urban ring that somehow you can't displace because now it's populated. And you end up with an expansion that goes in fits and starts. If you didn't have a centrist model, if you had a sort of distributive model, of course, it may be very difficult to actually persuade someone to spend significant sums of money on the redesign or refurbishment of Buenos Aires in its core. But if, for example, you had greenfield design to create new cities outside Buenos Aires, somewhere else, and the one thing that Argentina does have, of course, is an immense amount of space. And secondly, a very distinguished engineering community, and good engineers, doesn't matter whether you're in a desert zone or a wetlands area and so on, you can actually engineer things to work. Whereas in times past, in the older cities, you couldn't do that. There was always the difficulty of needing to be near a river, for example, whereas you don't necessarily need to do that. You can engineer the river if you choose to do it.
This is the concrete advice that you may be giving, which is Argentina should consider to create new cities.
Yes, because I think if you imagine what you're doing, create a city not necessarily the size of Buenos Aires, but nevertheless, if you couple that with innovation and with your thoughts on what sectors you want to grow next and the specific businesses, and you might want to create a technology park, you might want to have universities there, you might want to do a lot of dynamic things. But what inevitably will happen is that particularly the younger population will, as they do with all cities, migrate towards that new center of dynamism. Well, what that does is to delayer Buenos Aires as it is today. And if you at the same time engineer it so that you're actually creating small to medium enterprises in those sectors that you've identified, then you're actively moving towards the employment of people who are in the poorer communities and having them retrained in anticipation of what it is you're going to do in the new city. So if you end up with new cities in different places and you diffuse the bubble that you've got in the population explosion in Buenos Aires, so you've got people decanted almost to the new venues, then it gives you the chance and more space. So you're not just displacing people, but you are able to re-engineer Buenos Aires to be perhaps less dense than it previously was. But over time, you can actually re-engineer it to be much more fit for purpose. So actually, it's a way of countrifying, if you can put it this way, the urban environment by creating new centers that become cities for both for people to live in and to work in. But they've been specially designed, and if they're done in the way in which we're doing it in Africa, which is taking on board all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals for the UN, then clearly they become attractive places for people to go to and people to live.
That's very interesting. What do you think about the area of, I mean, the question is, of course, it probably requires further thought, but or thinking. But what do you believe where the city should be placed? Is it in the larger metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, including the Delta? Would you think on doing them across the country, in Patagonia, in the northern part? Would you have any particular thinking about that?
Well, I think inevitably, if you're going to do this at all, you should be doing it in a number of different places. Because when you look at the statistics, what you're doing, if you're thinking about this in this way anyway, is to say, we're really creating something that's an investment attraction seen from people from the outside. If people can see that they can invest in a new city, for example, they will view this in terms of property development returns on investment. And obviously, if it's been done in a modern way, and in particular, if it's got sustainable development objectives, and if it's brought in all of the innovations that it could bring in, including new companies, then it could be a very attractive proposition for external investors. But what you're actually doing is making use of external investors' willingness to participate and provide foreign direct investment at scale in order to change your future living conditions and societal change associated with it. I mean, from an internal country point of view, it's actually a change in the dynamics of and a development of social integration. But seen from the outside, people can just see it as property development and getting returns on it. Now, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind the scale of this as well. What we've just done in South Africa, we're able to demonstrate, and I can tell you a bit more about this if you wish, but we're able to demonstrate that with the use of $5 billion, we can create a city that's valued at about $20 billion within a very realistic time frame. Now, if you apply that to, say, your extended area of the Delta, I mean, I should say that I think there are parts of the Delta zone that are perfectly capable of developing as cities, and there are other parts that absolutely you'd wish to preserve for environmental reasons, for habitat reasons, and so on, and because it is a dynamic system and a dynamic ecosystem. So you have to be very careful about how you engineer things in and around the Delta. But I do think that in the fullness of time, if you're minded to do this around the plateau on the southern side and on the northern side in Uruguay, it's entirely possible to create something in that sort of zone. Patagonia equally, and in various places, close to the Andes, it's entirely possible to actually do what I'm suggesting. But the way I'd see it is, if this was something that was a national program to develop the overall economy, well, the returns on the use of $5 billion to get $20 billion, and if you create 3 of those, you're getting pretty close to your debt repatriation process. So, there are ways, therefore, in principle at least, where it ought to be possible to raise, in that case, $15 billion in order to improve the economy quite dramatically just by growing out of it. Now, I mean, it's easy for me to say, of course, it's more difficult to actually achieve. But what I can say is that, we are in discussions right now with parties that I can't name around that $5 billion investment in the South African project. And at no point in time have they said to us, look, forget it, we're not going to invest in South Africa because it's a dangerous place and it's had an apartheid history and it's got economic complexities and so on and so forth. Because they're looking at this in its own right. They're looking at this as an investment opportunity. And they know that many of the challenges that are certainly there in South Africa, we've been able to mitigate through the economic master planning process, which I should say, what I've done, Pablo, to be helpful to anyone who's interested in what we're doing in South Africa, this document, hopefully you can see, is an investment summary. I mean, the master plan itself is huge, and I wouldn't wish that you have to read that. But this document we've actually placed on our website, the front page of our website. There's a link to that document, just to make it easier for people to envisage what this is about.
Now, can you, mention what is new about it? So, let's say, why is it a new proposal, the city that you are designing in Africa?
Right. Well, this is an unusual context. We were approached originally by people by an investment bank who owned a property that historically was being developed for sugarcane. So it was agricultural land, but it was huge. It's the size of Manhattan. It's about 70 square kilometers or 7,000 hectares in size. But it's also unusual because it's sitting right next to one of the poorest communities in Africa. It's the former Zulu kingdom. They've gone through some very troubled times even recently. But this is an area which has got something like 50% unemployment. It's got a very high incidence of HIV/AIDS. It's got a female population that can't find work. There are many, many challenges that it faces, and this is a typical African rural community. And because of that, and because they haven't had the advantage as a Black community of being educated over a couple of decades, the problem always with a community that is living in poverty is in trying to imagine how they get themselves out of poverty. It's all too easy to wave your arms and say, well, if we improve the education system and they go through it, then eventually they'll be able to find employment. Well, that commits them to at least a decade, possibly 2 decades of waiting around whilst being educated. And these families are starving. So when we first looked at this, again, even though the people who are currently looking at it may look at it in terms of property development and investment and all the other things, we've looked at this throughout as social transformation. And we spent a long time trying to figure out exactly how we were going to support this community, because were we to build fancy buildings or whatever architecture it might be, or put in brand new technologies and so on, immediately adjacent to a very poor community, well, that to us is the same as apartheid. It's just economic apartheid rather than a color apartheid. And that's the last thing that any of us should be doing. It's obviously the least sustainable thing we should do either. So we concluded that, again, in looking through, well, what would you do in South Africa to transform the total economy? What could you bring to them that would make a serious material difference to the economy? Well, if you try to bring all that together, so you have a community that you want to support, the best way in which you can support them, of course, is to find them employment. To find them employment, you have to recognize the skills that they have today. You don't have to wait a decade to actually get those skills, and you then have to do something to help them to improve the skills. So thinking about, in that case, service sector activities, and especially because this is a remarkably beautiful place. It's a set of rolling old sand dunes with a 15-kilometer stretch of beach that's very similar to Copacabana Beach, but with no people on it. So, this is a very beautiful place, and it lends itself to tourism. Tourism, of course, is very big in South Africa anyway. So setting aside COVID for a moment, we knew that we would need to focus on tourism because that's the opportunity to bring people into employment as quickly as possible. But we also concluded that because we don't want to create a next generation divide by bringing people into a service economy where they're serving the middle classes from Europe and from the Americas and so on that simply want to go there as tourists, that we had to do more. So what we did was create 3,000 small to medium enterprises, created an investment bank that was there to help the community into a fair living wage, able to help to finance within their existing community schools of differing sorts, community halls, clinics, hospitals, and so on, out of the profitability of the overall venture. So we did quite a lot in terms of social construction, even before we started to do all of the visioneering and design work and so on. So that in itself, I would say, was innovative, because that was the starting point for it and really the general philosophy behind it. When we started beyond that, in terms of, well, okay, if we are doing tourism, what might a sustainable city look like? We drew the conclusion, first and foremost, that this needed to be a safe place for people who want to go to it. And of course, I'm pleased to say in some ways, although sad, mostly because of what's happened, that we were able to predict how you would do this in a world in which there were pandemics. We didn't know, of course, at the time that there was going to be one. But we have put in place a lot of features that allow you to both monitor and to control all of that. Let me mention a couple of them. Long before we had megacities, certainly in ancient times, not just in Europe, but in the Americas and in Asia as well, we had walled cities, ancient walled cities. Now, of course, in those times, they were walled cities because people marauded in and out of cities and they needed to be there for defensive purposes. But what we've done is to take, if you imagine San Gimignano in Italy, or Siena, or any of these glorious places, of course, they became the centers for social interaction. They became major cultural centers. So actually, many of in the Renaissance, certainly, many of the things that happened in Florence and so on were because of the close nature of those cities. Of course, now, a while later, they're still extraordinarily attractive places, as you know, to visit. But in our case, what we decided to do was to modernize them. So we designed actually 8 citadels that are not actually walled in a strict sense, but we've actually used the walls actually for accommodation. So if you imagine a ring of accommodation of apartments, of layered apartments associated with these cities, but they have their own internal architectures. So we designed 8 of them. So one is very similar, for example, to the Alhambra in Granada. So it's a garden city. Another is a sports citadel. So it's got everything that Boca Juniors would dream of, plus some more things of a variety of sports, in a whole city. So we have cities within cities, and they're all connected up. So that was one innovation. But of course, if you're doing it that way, you need to think about all the transportation issues. We have, of course, because we've been involved in electric vehicles, are keen to actually transition from where we are today to where we are going to be. So we've actually designed the core of the city, which is more dense, a bit more like Barcelona, without any traditional vehicles at all. It's got e-taxis. It's got a tram line, which runs for about 35 kilometers around the place, electric trams, trackless trams. And then we've designed 80,000 homes, and we've made use of those. And this is perhaps an interesting point. When you start out thinking about what you're going to do to have accommodation in a sustainable city, it isn't just a question of the architecture. It's a question of how you're going to actually design it so that you're solving other problems. Now, we spent quite a lot of time developing 3D printing activity. Nowadays you can build a house, American scale house, in a day with robots. Most people are doing it right now with concrete. Of course, the smarter game will be to do it by taking out the water and using waste carbon dioxide, which you can do to create eco-concrete. But there's a step beyond that where you're actually using biomaterials. You can grow hemp, for example. You can actually induce the hemp to be not quite as structurally sound as concrete, but certainly sound enough to be able to do it in biomaterials. It's got good insect repellent properties and good thermal properties and so on. So And what we also did was use what's called thin film solar technique. So if you imagine every surface of your house, you're not thinking about this after you've built your house and putting a solar panel on the roof. You're actually making the surfaces of your house the powerhouse. So every house then is its own powerhouse. And that means you don't have to have power generation from the outside. You don't have to have reticulation, complexities, and so on and so forth. So that gives you some ideas about the way in which innovation can be brought into the actual design process. And it means, of course, you've got to deal with everything. You've got to, understand material sciences and technologies and transportation issues and so on and so forth. But that's what Imaginatives is about, is actually being a group that's, likes to think about all these things together.
Now, coming to that point, how do you describe Imaginatives? I think it's a very interesting and very different proposal of a company. So what exactly is it about?
Well, it's a very young organization full of young people like me. Actually, most of them are young. We hope that by the summer we'll be at about 60 people. So it's still a very small business. But a number of us have been around for long enough and have been advisors to most of the development banks, many of the big companies, and done a lot of general economic development work. But for me, it started actually 30 years ago because I was kindly invited by Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was then the Norwegian Prime Minister. You are too young to remember this, Pablo, but she actually produced something called Our Common Future, which was really the starting point for sustainability and for climate change and for many of the things now in environmental protections. She and a number of others, Maurice Strong in Canada and a few others, were very keen back in the late 80s to see us walk down a road towards sustainability. So I've been doing this for quite a while, in different guises, but we decided to bring Imaginatives together really to concentrate on how you do comprehensive sustainability across all of the differing facets of it, and how you bring innovation into each of those facets. I think the tendency is, you'll know, of course, about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that United Nations produced in about 2015. I think the problem in part is that when you look around at how we manage projects, I'm not trying to be disparaging about the World Bank or IFC or others, because they have to be practical about what they do. But we do tend to see things in silos. We tend to see things as a water supply project or a sanitation project or a road building project and so on. And that's perfectly fine. But when you're looking at whole cities or whole economies, of course, there's little point people having a new house without having electricity in it or food to eat or transport to get them there or from there. You really got to think about everything all at once. So Imaginatives, in part, is a bit of a think tank, I suppose. It's an ideas factory for how we bring forward a lot of things that other people have invented that we didn't, but putting those pieces of the jigsaw together. So I think it probably wouldn't be a normal process for people to think about, what the combination is of hemp production on the one hand and thin film solar development on the other, or rainwater capture processes, or something similar. And if you're thinking about building a house, well, you tend not to think about those novelties. But for us, the excitement is, how do you actually take the best of all of those and then reimagine them into the context in which you're placed? And not all of them apply every day, of course, but there's such a lot of innovation out there that never really sees the light of day because everyone is very focused on that particular innovation without thinking about how it's going to be applied, across a greater context. So I suppose our thesis, and because it's such an early days company, it remains to be seen whether we succeed in doing it this way, But our thesis, certainly in relation to the African Art Project, was that, look, we can always go and find investors in 3D printing or in electric vehicles or in material sciences or whatever. But is it not more interesting for us to bundle those into a larger context that people can understand with multi-layers of innovation, and have people see this not through the rather complex process of brand new things happening, for which there is always a sharp intake of breath when you ask them to invest in it, but see it more as it's a city. Would you like to build a city? And we just happen to have a lot of novelty in the way in which we're going to do it. So it actually, we propose, is going to be an easier process to bring forward all of these ideas, some of them crazy perhaps, but many of them not, into a bigger context in order to then move these innovations forward much more rapidly.
Very, very interesting, Harry. Let me go to a final question to you, asking on how do you see the world changing with the pandemia? What do you believe is really at the core of what is going on, and what we may be seeing in the near future changing around us?
Well, like everyone, we've been alarmed by what's happened over the last year or so, but not entirely surprised. We've actually spent for free over the last year a lot of time and effort supporting the vaccines programs, the diagnostics programs, the new ways of doing things, both with our government here and various companies in different parts of the world, because we think that's the right thing to do. And we have expertise in the healthcare area, just as we have in some of the others. I think the state of play at the moment is that we're over-dependent upon vaccine solutions that have had to be necessarily rushed through a process that would ordinarily have taken many more years than they have. And what we're seeing, sadly, is that there has been a false hope that some of the vaccines coming from certain countries would prove effective, and we're now discovering that perhaps they haven't been as effective, and we're having to go through that process again. All of this, of course, is intimately connected to the global economy, and the global economy has been devastated. There is no doubt that the impacts of that are going to take 5 to 10 years to unravel. And that's why I think there is a need, although it may sound odd, to think very creatively about how we induce the global economies to move faster. We have to come up with some fresh thinking about how we're going to do that. I think the reality today is that although we are aware of some therapies, drug therapies, that are showing good promise for actually controlling COVID-19, currently we're running around the world chasing variants. And the vaccines programs have proved effective so far, but there are, as you know, some other variants, in particularly the one from India, which is problematic, and we'll probably need yet another round of research and development in order to create vaccines that are capable of handling those. The difficulty, of course, is that very few countries, A, have access to vaccines, and B, have the finance to be able to afford to pay for them, even if they do have that. Now, I have a good friendship with Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate, and he, of course, is famous for solving many issues around poverty. And he makes it very clear with a lot of people around the world who are equally distinguished that we really must be doing a lot more for, broadly speaking, what are called developing countries, because it is absolutely the case. I mean, if we learned anything at all from this pandemic, it's that we are all absolutely connected to each other. There is no such thing as safety on your own, because you're never on your own. And therefore, it is perfectly true that none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And therefore, it makes eminent sense for us to do everything we can to support everybody. But the practicalities of how you achieve that are really where the heartland of the problem lies today. And I've got to say that the fear that some of us have, we're working with a team in the United States right now. It's actually based at Harvard University. They're looking at ways to accelerate our understanding of viruses and the immune system by doing supercomputer modeling and artificial intelligence, types of activities. Now, I mean, we need to do that because we know that there are at least 90 other coronaviruses in the animal populations that could just as easily migrate as this one did. And that's only coronavirus. And as these things are interlinked, as climate change continues, and for anyone who denies that climate change is happening, they're completely foolish about things. It is happening. For as long as that continues, there will be further viral impacts. So, there's a case in point in terms of innovation. What we've actually proved is that if you actually trust top flight scientists, not quacks, there are plenty of quacks out there that are trying to sell snake oil, and make money for themselves, which is a shameful thing to do in a pandemic. But nevertheless, there are people doing that. But if you actually trust real scientists who don't care about money, what they care about is solving problems, and you give them the budgets that they need to actually do what they do best, then you do get world-class vaccines produced in no time, which is what's happened. So there's a lesson for everyone, every country. If you're not going to support your innovators, then you're going to end up with a situation similar to this on some basis. You're not going to be ready for the next generation of activity. You're not going to be able to defend yourselves against any onslaught of viruses or bacterial infections or anything else. You've got to actually make the strategic investments early enough in the process because these things take time to evolve. You can't throw money at scientists at the last minute and expect them the next day to come up with a solution. But I have to say that, if you've thought through the history of this, of people like Watson and Crick and similar people who were involved in that, Rosalind Franklin and so on, in the early days of DNA and so on, that then went into the Human Genome Project that gestated for, a number of years. None of the people who were involved in that were thinking about the commerciality of it. They were thinking about understanding what the human genome is about. We need the same for human immunome. So I think it's absolutely clear that we're all in this together. We've all got to join hands together. We've all got to figure this out together. And there are some solutions. So I wouldn't wish people who are listening to this to be downhearted by it all. There are some brilliant people around the world who are solving these problems, and they will break this coronavirus. But I would say realistically, given the logistics of everything, we're probably talking about next year rather than this year.
And given the close link, as you were mentioning, between this pandemic and climate change, how do you see the policies, the Green Deals, so to say, that Europe is talking about, and even Biden, the new administration of the US, has been presented to the Congress, and it is in discussion in the US. Do you see an improvement in those policies?
Well, I've been involved in those sorts of issues for a long time. I was actually, when I was an academic, way back when, I was on sabbatical at the University of East Anglia, it's called, where they have the climate change unit. So I've known about the issue of climate change for a long time. It's a similar story. We've all left it far, far, far too late to actually get to grips with this, or even to recognize it. And of course, during the past administration in the States, there was complete denial of it even existing. So it's a delight to hear what President Biden and similar people are doing to try and move this agenda forwards. The difficulty is, genuine difficulty for everyone, is that it isn't just the willingness to resolve carbon dioxide emissions, for example, in its own right. There is plenty of goodwill about reducing carbon dioxide emissions. But if I come back to South Africa, for example, there's a country that's gone through more troubles than many, and its economy is in a difficult state. It has a power monopoly player that is bankrupt, and all of its power stations are coal-fired, and most of the economy depends upon the use of coal. So we are right now, for example, working with them to try to transition their energy mix to make it cleaner. But these things can't happen overnight. You know, for all the, I would love it to be the case that we had entirely what are called renewables energy, but it's an unrealistic picture right now. If you look at what are called Sankey diagrams of the energy mixes of most countries, you'll find that renewables are still a very minuscule part of their energy mix. On the other hand, California, obviously a big global economy in its own right, is now about 95% renewables energy. So I think these initiatives are immensely important. I think that the political will right now is there, but in the aftermath of the pandemic, the fear factor that I think we all have is that there'll be some slippage in paying attention to climate change, because understandably people are dealing with the current crisis. But if we don't in parallel deal with the climate crisis and understand how we reimagine the economies to be capable of handling the climate issues sensibly in the future, then we'll find ourselves in another 10 years still talking about this rather than doing something about it. And it'll probably be beyond the tipping point by then. I know that I gave a speech in 2015, which did an analysis which gave us 14 years to avoid the tipping point of getting to 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade increase. And now we are where we are. And so I think, you know, that's my fear factor, is that we just take our eye off the ball.
So Harry, I'd like to say that this has been a very interesting conversation, and we have covered a wide range of topics, ideas. I highly appreciate it. And to finish, I'd like to say that it's again a real honor for us, the Argentinian Engineering Center, to be naming you honorary fellow of our institution. That's a way to include you in our extended family. And it's also going to be a way of having you around, picking your brain from time to time, and getting you involved when it is possible in some of our activities. So for us, it is also a way of spreading our capacity and becoming our reach more international. So we highly appreciate your acceptance of our nomination to your new degree, so to say, of honorary fellow. And with this, I'd like to leave it to you to give a final message before we close our event.
Well, I think the honor is entirely mine. I understand how distinguished an institution this is, and I'm immensely flattered that you've decided to involve me in it. What I would say to everyone who's involved in this or hears this in Argentina and indeed in Latin America is that if you feel there is anything that we can do in my newfound capacity as an honorary fellow, feel free to contact me. Pablo has my details, and you're very welcome to contact us at any point in time. I think our interests lie in making a difference. I mean, that's really what Imaginatives is about. And if you think there are ways in which we can help you to do that, then we'd be delighted, of course, to do it.
Thank you very much, Harry, and to all of the people that have been taking part of this event. It is a real pleasure. Let's talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
I look forward to it. Thanks. Bye.